In today's video, we are going to look at a few different methods on how to integrate conventional total station surveying data with GNSS-derived data and even differential leveling data. We'll explore a range of methods ranging from very quick and easy, but less accurate, to performing an in-depth least squares adjustment using 4 different input data types. Why would we want to combine survey data types in the first place? Combining GNSS measurements with total station data is an easy and effective way to georeference your total station data. Without mixing the two, our only option other than astronomic observations, which aren't ideal for several reasons, is to survey between 2 known points that have absolute positions already defined and shift your data set to one of the control monuments and rotate to the other. This works to georeference total station data if you're lucky enough to have 2 control monuments close by. Some might then ask, why not just survey everything with RTK GNSS? Why bother with a total station or differential level? 2 reasons: accuracy and the ability to set control or measure points under overhead obstructions. If I need to set control that requires better accuracy than a few centimeters, then I know I'll either need to tighten it up with total station data if both horizontal and vertical accuracy are important, or if vertical accuracy must be better than a few centimeters, but if horizontal accuracy isn't as important, I can use a differential level. However, this is fairly rare that I would take this approach. One of the simplest and easiest methods to combine GNSS RTK data with total station data is to set a minimum of 2 points with RTK that have line of sight to each other, and then set a total station on one and backsight the other. Ideally, you would set additional points as checks. This can be done in the same data collector and in the same job depending on what field software you're using, or if you have 2 different brands of equipment that don't run off the same field surveying software, you can simply export or write down the RTK-derived coordinates and input them into the software that runs your total station. Just be sure to either use the same mapping projection for both jobs, or make sure both jobs are working in ground so you're not combining grid and ground data. On a quick side note, something to keep an eye out for is if you do set a mapping projection in your field surveying software, but use assumed coordinates along the lines of 10,000 meters north, 5,000 meters east, the data collector will be applying an incorrect ground-to-grid scale factor. It will be calculating a scale factor for that mapping projection in the wrong location that could be significantly incorrect, and applying it to every distance measured with the total station. So either make sure you're exporting your RTK measurements scaled up to ground if you're using assumed coordinates for the total station measurements, of course also collected in ground or using a scale factor of 1.0, or use approximately correct mapping projection coordinates for your total station data collection, and obviously set the correct mapping projection for both your total station and RTK jobs. This will ensure your total station measurements are being scaled properly. Basically, just don't mix grid and ground coordinates. They are not one and the same. A meter in grid or mapping projection coordinates does not equal a meter on the ground or what you would pull on a tape measure. You can also set more than 2 points and do a resection. This will allow you to distribute the absolute positioning error through multiple points instead of holding your total station setup point as fixed. It will also distribute the error in the determination of the orientation in a similar manner. The issue with using either of these methods in the field is that the error in your control network's orientation will be determined in part by the quality to which the points within line of sight were set with RTK, which means you're trying to distribute a bunch of RTK error over a relatively short baseline. Let's look at an example to get an idea of what kind of error we could be dealing with. The white circles have a radius of 3 centimeters, a representation of what could be considered typical precision at a 95% confidence for an RTK observation under mediocre conditions. The green line denotes an error-free traverse. This will represent our true values. The red line denotes the same traverse using the exact same geometry. However, this time the setup points 201 and 200 have been located via RTK, and those measurements happen to land on the edge of the air ellipse of the true points. They are measured 3 centimeters out in opposite directions, which means over the 50-meter backsight, we now have 4 minutes and 8 seconds of air in our orientation. We may only be 3 centimeters out at our setup point, but what happens when we start traversing along with that 4 minutes of air in the orientation of our baseline? Well, the next hub is only 50 meters away, and now we are out 87 millimeters. As we continue to traverse another pair of 50-meter legs, we are now out 178 millimeters. And by the time we finish a 500-meter open traverse, we're out almost half a meter. This is because our whole control network is crooked by over 4 minutes. I just want to take a brief side note to drive home that this is not only an issue with trying to georeference a traverse in the field and with open traverses, but even when you start to branch off of a closed traverse. As you add traverse legs without a closure, error starts to accumulate rather quickly. Just something to keep in mind when you're traversing. Try to close out any spur legs whenever possible, and if you can't, just be mindful of what that means for your accuracy. In those situations, I will often run additional rounds or use common points to triangulate the spur legs, but that technique requires a least squares adjustment. So, is it possible to fix that half meter of air in the field in the above example? It is. What you would need to do is take another RTK measurement on your furthest traverse point and then use your field surveying software to rotate and shift your total station points to your RTK points. We can essentially do the same process but in CAD, which makes things a bit easier. Again, shifting and rotating beyond the line of sight is the key to reducing error with this method. The longer the baseline is that we can fit the RTK error into, the better off we will be. Building off the first example, we have the same red line that we are going to shift to. However, in the previous example, the 2 points that had the potential 3 centimeter error due to RTK were only 50 meters apart because they required a line of sight. Now the 2 RTK points with the 3 centimeters of error in opposing directions are 500 meters apart because we aren't restricted to points that have to have direct line of sight with each other. Now we're still out 3 centimeters on each end because we're shifting and rotating to points that are 3 centimeters out. But the error contained within the traverse is less than that at either end, given that in this example the traverse is error-free. However, this method, whether done in CAD or in the data collector, only uses 2 matching control points on either end and ignores everything going on between each end. If there was a way we could rely not only on 1 point for position and 1 bearing for orientation and could rather distribute the error between several points, we could probably tighten things up a bit. This is where a Helmholtz transformation comes into play. I have a Helmholtz transformation list for CAD that can be used in this situation, and I'll leave a download link in the description below. But many field surveying softwares have a similar program built in to shift one set of points to another as well. In fact, resections often use a Helmholtz transformation to shift the observed setup point from a setup's local coordinate system to the observed known coordinate system. A Helmholtz transformation basically best fits one data set to another using common points. The list I'm using today gives us the option to scale, which we will forgo as there shouldn't be any scale applied as long as we capture both data sets in the same coordinate system. The Helmholtz list lets you choose as many common points as you wish to match the 2 coordinate systems, and will shift and rotate the source data to best fit the target data while retaining the geometry of the network it shifts and rotates. This is to say, it's only shifting and rotating the entire data set as a whole while not manipulating the internal geometry. There will be no angular changes between legs. When we use Helmholtz like a resection, it's distributing the error over numerous points and not just fitting it in either end point. The result when we do this with the same geometry we've been using is that we don't see those large 3 centimeter deviations on either end like we did when we used the shift and rotate method. The error is much more evenly distributed. The downfall of this method is that it's completely ignoring the quality of the measurements that were used to derive the position of these points, and it's just shifting, rotating, and scaling the network to best fit it as a whole. This brings us to our final method of integrating data from different sources, least squares. Many consider a least squares adjustment to be the gold standard of adjusting survey data. Least squares can trace its roots back several centuries, where it grew out of the field of astronomy. Carl Gauss is widely accepted as the first person to propose the idea of least squares. I'm sure many of you have heard of the term Gaussian distribution, also known as normal distribution, or a bell curve of statistical uncertainty, which is fundamental to the evaluation of surveying measurements, which a least squares adjustment does for us. When combining total station data and GNSS data, a least squares adjustment does not simply shift and rotate one dataset to another. It combines the data and adjusts the coordinates in such a way that it finds the statistical most likely location of each point, so that a minimum sum of the squares of the errors or residuals of the measurements are determined, aka least squares. To put it another way, it shifts and adjusts every single point in the network over and over again until those points land in a position where the measurements that created those points have the smallest possible error. How does it do this? Complex mathematics that some have characterized as mathematics that no mortal could do by hand. While that quote might have a bit of flair on it, modern least squares programs are able to calculate a typical adjustment in a fraction of a second that would probably take weeks to do by hand. There are many different options when it comes to choosing a program to run a least squares adjustment on your survey data. Trimble has TBC, Leica has Infinity, Topcon has Magnet Tools. They all work. I can't speak to how well or how user-friendly they are, as I haven't had enough time with them to give an accurate comparison. One thing to keep in mind when choosing which software to invest time and money in is, are you sure you'll always be processing data from that particular manufacturer? I am often getting raw observation data from different manufacturers, Trimble total station observations, raw Leica leveling data, Topcon RTK vector data, and often these need to be used in the same project. When it comes to combining data from numerous manufacturers, Microsurvey StarNet really shines. StarNet is one of the most robust and trusted least squares adjustment software packages for survey data out there. It has been a staple in the industry for almost 40 years, and it allows you to combine total station data, RTK data, post-process static data, and differential leveling data all in the same project, and allows the user input over how much weighting is applied to each method of data capture with extreme flexibility. Because it uses raw observation data, you also don't have to worry about incorrect scale factors being applied by the data collector software, which I talked about earlier. It works with the raw observations that haven't been manipulated by the field data collector software via any grid-to-ground scale factors that were applied. You can export your adjusted coordinates in the mapping projection of your choice and simultaneously create a ground-based coordinate file scaled exactly how you want. Besides just being able to combine data types, one of the most important features of StarNet is that it allows you to use redundant observations and crossties to strengthen your control network. For example, if we have a closed traverse, we could run a compass rule adjustment on it, which takes into account the deviation between the starting and closing points, but it has no ability to use intermediate check shots and weighted redundant observations to adjust the network. Whereas with StarNet, you can use all of your redundant measurements to adjust and strengthen your control network. This allows you to reach levels of accuracy that are simply not possible with other simplistic adjustment techniques such as the compass rule adjustment. Enough talk, let's get into some data and see how it all works. I'm going to start a new project and import some processed static baselines, some base rover RTK observations, a couple days of total station data, and 3 level loop runs of raw observations, and work through all the data. The first thing I'll do when starting a new project is go through the project settings and make sure I have the correct mapping projection set, the right geoid model, and the instrument settings are appropriate for the equipment and methodology that were used. Our first data file is simply the NGS datasheets from the 3 cores that were used to process the static baseline data. Using these publicly available datasheets, I will extract the coordinates of the cores and their associated standard deviations and enter them into a format StarNet will recognize. StarNet doesn't process static baselines directly. It reads the data file that is exported from the software that you use to process the baselines. For example, if I were using Trimble data, I would process the baselines in TBC and export an ASCII file that StarNet can read. The imported GNSS static file separates each observation, which includes the from and to points, the delta x, y, and z, Earth-centered, Earth-fixed Cartesian vectors between the 2 points, not to be confused with northing, eastings, and elevations, and the weighting information of the observation. The weighting information is dependent on the manufacturer. It can either be in standard errors and correlations or covariances, as is the case with this data set. We can now process the static data to get some initial coordinates for our observed points. I'll use the chi-squared test to quickly determine if there's an issue with the data so far. The chi-squared test basically compares the error determined from the adjustment of the data with the expected error based on the instrument specs and the network geometry. If the error determined was exactly as expected, a value of 1.0 will be shown. Less than 1 means the error determined is less than what was expected, a happy problem, and a value larger than 1 means the error determined was more than what was expected. Our GPS deltas are failing the chi-squared test, which means we have more error than the instrument specs are saying we should have. Fortunately for us, StarNet makes singling out problem measurements a breeze. To begin the process, I will look at the adjusted GPS vector observations, which I sorted by standardized residual. A standardized residual is simply a ratio determined by dividing the measurement's residual by the standard error for that measurement. If the residual for a particular measurement is the exact same as what was expected, you'll get a value of 1. If it's worse, you'll get a value larger than 1. Very similar to the chi-squared test, and these standardized residuals are actually used to determine the chi-squared values. All standardized residuals above 3 are flagged with an asterisk, which means they generally require further investigation as to why that measurement is of relatively poor quality. I'll start by removing the worst observation, reprocessing the adjustment, and repeat the process until I no longer fail the chi-squared test to determine if it was a single observation causing the issue or if there is a larger issue at hand. In this case, it seems like all 3 observations from the cores MDSI aren't as good as we would expect. There isn't a blunder here per se, but the quality of measurement from MDSI isn't quite as good as we would expect. I can completely remove those observations as I still have vectors from 2 other cores to the same points, but in this case, I will use an inline operator that tells StarNet to scale the weighting values used for those observations. For example, if the vector between MDSI and 1003 had an initial horizontal standard error of 5 millimeters, now that GNSS vector standard error will be scaled up by 6, giving us 30 millimeters, and it will have far less weighting on it in the determination of 1003. With a scale factor of 6 horizontally and 2 vertically, we now pass the total chi-squared test. I like to keep track of the error propagation of my adjusted coordinates as I go to see how the quality of the control network is changing as data gets added. So far, I'm seeing values I would expect to see from static process data. You'll notice the error ellipses for the core stations are much smaller. That is because those are heavily influenced by the values NGS quoted for those stations that we entered in, whereas the values for our measured points were calculated 100% from StarNet, and we obviously have much fewer observations to our 3 on-site points than what NGS used to locate their cores. Now we can bring in our RTK observations. A local base receiver was set up on all 3 of the previously tied control points, and used to set additional site control. The vector file will look very similar to the post-process static data vector file. We will take the same approach as before, process the new data with the previous data, assess the quality, and remove bad observations if required. This dataset actually processed out very well. It's a good idea to resist the urge to simply go off of the results of the chi-squared test and make sure you go into the listings file and see if there are any bad observations hiding in there. Everything looks good, and again, we'll take a closer look at those coordinate error ellipses. The additional short baseline RTK observations tightened up the initial 3 points quite a bit. In fact, all of the error ellipses look very good. Some may even question if these numbers are too good for RTK. Well, let's take another look at the measurement data. You can see that every point is tied numerous times from 3 different base points. For example, 1001 was tied twice from all 3 different base points. That's 6 different RTK observations to the same point. If I break out a single observation, we get a more realistic idea of an accuracy for that particularly high quality RTK observation under optimal conditions, free of the influences of multipath and atmospheric distortions, and with good view of the sky and good satellite geometry. I should also know that I did go through the data and break apart the redundant RTK observations, and they all agreed to each other extremely well. This was a very high quality data set for RTK. Now might be a good time to get eyes on exactly where this project is. The network plot has the ability to bring in background imagery, but I prefer to export a KML and view it in Google Earth. I found the exported KML from StarNet extremely handy, and I use it on every georeference job I process, both internally and shared externally with clients. So as it stands right now, we have a control network of points good to around 6 or 7 millimeters horizontally and 11 to 12 millimeters vertically. Not bad at all. Like I said before, the RTK observations from this dataset were extraordinarily good. At this point, there could be several reasons we want to add total station data. It should get those error ellipses smaller, and it will allow you to set control in areas where you can't use RTK, such as indoors or under overhead obstructions. We'll import our 2 total station datasets and rerun the adjustment. The chi-squared values are okay. The observations all have okay standardized residuals, but this wasn't a particularly great total station dataset vertically. When I look closer at the data, it's obvious by the varying heights of targets that they were using a tripod and tribrac for their backsite. This method is usually great horizontally if the tribrac is in adjustment, but it has a very noticeable effect on the vertical component of a traverse. I've processed probably thousands of traverses in StarNet, and after a while you begin to notice trends in the data. Time after time, whenever I get a data set where tripods and tribracs were used for backsites, they always suffer vertically. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Which height is defined more accurately and consistently? A GLS12 that snaps into a set height and has a wear-resistant carbide tip, or measuring a slant from a control point to the side of a prism on a tripod and tribrac. When I go back to my error ellipses, there is a slight improvement, but not a huge difference. We're down to about 5 or 6 millimeters horizontally and 10 millimeters vertically. But at least using the total station gave us the opportunity to set control in places we could not do so reliably before. So we're happy with our horizontal coordinate quality, but 10 millimeters is pushing it a bit for the vertical component given the application for our control network. We failed to clean that up with the total station data, so the next step is differential leveling. StarNet can accept raw differential observation files directly from the instrument and process those. This is handy for level loop checks and blunder detection, but it also allows for proportional adjustment of each leveling leg based on its length. Or you can simply input the adjusted elevations from your field notes or other processing software manually. Both work, both have their pros and cons. Since I handbook my level runs and adjust them by hand, I usually go the route of making what StarNet calls E-records, which is basically just assigning an elevation to a point number. We can either hold these as fixed or apply a standard error to the E-records that we feel is appropriate. In this example, I will process the leveling data from the differential level and export the elevations of the points and apply an appropriate standard error to those values. I will start by turning off the rest of the other data files and turning on the leveling data files. Then I will reopen the project settings and switch the project from 3D to leveling and change my coordinate export type. The data files include 3 level loops that run from 2 different NGS benchmarks to all of the control points that were previously established. I'm holding the NGS benchmark elevations as fixed to process the level data. The chi-squared value is within range, and next I will run a level loop check to see how each one closed. Here we get the error of closure and also the standard error for that loop. The worst loop closure was 2 millimeters, and the other ones were well under 1 millimeter. And the standard error of each loop is generally hovering around 2 millimeters, and that's what I'll use to weight my E-records. I can jump over to the coordinates tab, copy the output, and paste it into a new data file that can house these values. I'll quickly switch back to a 3D project and switch the format of my coordinate points file to a CSV and reprocess the data. The change in elevations between with the leveling data and without was anywhere between 1 and 6 millimeters, which is actually really impressive considering our initial elevations were derived from static data and influenced by RTK data. And finally, our error ellipses. The horizontal values are the same, but vertically we went from 10 millimeters before down to most values being at 1 millimeter with one outlier at 3 millimeters. Why is point 1010 almost 3 times worse than the other points? Well, it was missed in the level loop run. The only reason it's as low as it is because the point it is observed from, either via RTK measurements or total station measurements, were in the level loop run and had their elevations defined precisely. So the question is, do you need to use least squares adjustment on your survey data? No, you don't need to. You also don't need to use a total station. Grab a tape measure and a compass and theoretically you're surveying. But StarNet lets you combine conventional GNS and leveling data into a single control network and check the validity of your results. It enables a surveyor to assign the appropriate weights to measurements based on the quality of the given measurement. It allows flexibility during data collection where field data can be collected in any order and in multiple configurations. It helps with the identification of blunders and errors. It provides you with an error propagation report that outlines the derived coordinate standard deviations. And most importantly, it adjusts your data to calculate the most likely result for each point in a manner that is mathematically superior to any other adjustment technique. With the relatively low cost of today's least squares adjustment packages and all the benefits that come with it, and the ease of use, it really doesn't make sense not to use one. It might seem like a daunting procedure at first, but once you've run through the process a number of times, it's rare that it would take you more than 30 minutes to process a fairly intricate control network. StarNet isn't the only least squares adjustment package out there for survey data. There are others. Some are cheaper, some are even free, but in my experience and in my opinion, none are better. It really is the best bang for your buck when it comes to surveying equipment and software, and I couldn't imagine trying to survey without it. Thank you all for watching, and as always, subscribe if you want, like if you feel it's warranted, and I'll see you next time.